Lecture 10, we're going to talk more about how the respiratory rate is controlled. So you guys, of course, remember that you have cardiovascular control centers in the medulla oblongata, that part of the lower part of the brainstem, and control of respiration also occurs in the brainstem as well. The main groups that are involved in controlling respiration are in the medulla, and then you also have an area in the pons as well. But the two main groups are called the DRG and the VRG. The DRG stands for dorsal respiratory group. So remember, dorsal refers to the posterior side of the body. So this dorsal respiratory group is a cluster of neurons that is located on the posterior side of the medulla. The ventral respiratory group is a cluster of neurons located on the anterior or the ventral side of the medulla. So the medulla is, you may have heard before that the brainstem is involved in controlling things like heart rate and respiratory rate, some of those vital functions. And again, there are specific clusters of neurons within the brainstem that are involved in those processes. So your DRG is actually near the root of cranial nerve pair number 9. Remember those? Branch off of the that part of the brainstem. And its job, what it does is it takes incoming information. There are incoming sensory impulses that are coming from stretch receptors. We'll talk a little bit about those later. And chemoreceptors. Now, we heard about those when we were studying cardiovascular control. Chemoreceptors are neurons, sensory neurons, that react to changes in blood chemistry in some way. So some of them monitor carbon dioxide levels, some monitor oxygen levels, some monitor hydrogen ion levels, pH. So they're monitoring chemicals and reacting to those. So they're called chemoreceptors. So integration means that cluster of neurons there is receiving signals, and then it makes decisions about whether or not to send impulses over here to the VRG, your ventral respiratory group. Because the ventral respiratory group, the neurons there, are actually the ones that send out the impulses that stimulate breathing. So the VRG is actually your rhythm generating. It sets the breathing rhythm. So it's going to fire impulses outward to the skeletal muscles, the diaphragm, the intercostals that control your breathing. It also does integration as well. And integration means, okay, the neurons there may be receiving stimulatory signals and inhibitory signals from other sources, and it has to put those things together and make a decision about whether or not to increase or decrease the breathing rate. Okay, eupnea is a term, EU, that prefix means true. So that's the normal breathing rate or true breathing rate, eupnea. You may hear, you'll see this term as well. Dyspnea means an abnormal breathing rate. Within this VRG, you have, that's a cluster of neurons, and some of those are inspiratory neurons. That doesn't mean they're inspiring. It just means that they are the ones that send out impulses that tell your inspiratory muscles to contract. That's the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. So the axons of those neurons travel through, or these impulses that are going to stimulate those muscles travel through the phrenic nerves and the intercostal nerves. So those are branches off of spinal nerves, and you may or may not have learned the identities of those when you took Biology 201, but just they're branches off of spinal nerves that supply the muscles around the thoracic cavity. Okay, then there are some expiratory neurons or expiratory neurons within that cluster as well, and what they do is they inhibit. Remember, you can have neurons that send impulses to other neurons and inhibit them, make it less likely that they're going to generate their action potentials or nerve impulses. And so that's their job. When needed, they're going to inhibit the inspiratory neurons. So if the inspiratory neurons are excited, your breathing rate's going to go up because they're going to fire more impulses to your breathing muscles. If the inspiratory neurons are inhibited, they're going to fire fewer impulses to your breathing muscles, and your breathing rate is going to slow down. Okay, there is also a breathing control area called the pontine respiratory center. Remember your three parts of your brainstem. You got your mesencephalon there, or midbrain, and then this is the pons, and then this is the medulla down here. So the pontine respiratory center is a cluster of neurons in the pons, and the axons of the neurons there extend downward to the VRG and the DRG and influence the decision making that's going on there in those breathing control areas. The pontine respiratory is supposed to smooth the respiratory pattern and make sure that your breathing rate and so forth is not erratic. All right, like they're showing you here, it's this the ventral respiratory group here, where you have the neurons that are sending impulses to your intercostal muscles in the diaphragm, telling them to contract, which will make you inspire or take in air. And then the dorsal respiratory group back here takes in input from chemoreceptors and stretch receptors and makes decisions about, hey, we need to increase or decrease the breathing rate. And it sends signals over to the VRG, and by doing that, it's influencing how fast or how slowly you are breathing. Okay, so what are some of these things that will trigger adjustments in respiratory rate? We've already talked about some of this a little bit in earlier lectures. The partial pressure of CO2 is a biggie. So just to review, what did we say about increased CO2 in our body fluids? What does that do to our pH? It lowers it, and it's because of that equilibrium, that back and forth chemical reaction that we talked about in a previous lecture. But as I was telling you, the easiest way to think about it is as CO2 levels go up, pH goes down. Your body fluids become more acidic. All right, so if that is happening, let's say for some reason CO2 levels are going up. Now, what would trigger that? One of the things could be extracellular respiration. When you're exercising, your CO2 levels are going to go up, right? Because you're breaking down more nutrients. That's where the CO2 comes from. So if that happens, there's a term for that. Hyper, as you guys know, refers to high or excessive, and capnia refers to CO2 levels, hypercapnia. So if you have CO2 levels rising in the body fluids surrounding your brainstem, that's going to combine with water. That's going to make carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into H plus and HCO3 minus bicarbonate ions. So you've got more of those around. That lowers your pH. So there are chemoreceptors in the medulla that detect. They're sensitive to increasing concentrations of hydrogen ions. They're sensitive to that lower pH. Okay, so you have neurons there whose job it is to monitor those hydrogen ion levels. And if the pH is dropping, the hydrogen ion levels are too high, those neurons send impulses to these respiratory control centers, and that triggers an increase in the depth and the rate of breathing. So what's the difference there, depth and rate? Depth is how deep you're breathing. Are you taking in, are you moving into your inspiratory reserve volume areas and going above just a normal tidal volume? And then rate, of course, is how quickly you're inhaling and exhaling. So your respiratory control centers influence both of those things. All right, and this is a diagram from your textbook, which is just showing this in a diagram type form. So as arterial carbon dioxide levels go up, blood fluids and other body fluids exchange with each other. So you're also going to have increased CO2 in the ECF surrounding the brainstem, that extracellular fluid. And then you have those chemoreceptors that monitor hydrogen ion levels in there, and they're supposed to account for about 70% of the response to changes in CO2 levels. All right, and then those neurons send afferent impulses. Remember, afferent means incoming to those medulla respiratory centers or medullary respiratory centers. They're in the brainstem. And then that ventral respiratory group is going to send afferent impulses out to your respiratory muscles, telling them to contract more frequently. That's going to influence the rate, and also to generate stronger contractions. You're going to have stronger contractions generated, and that is going to increase the depth of your breathing. All right, so that increases ventilation. More CO2 is exhaled. You breathe out more CO2. So if you have dropping CO2 levels now in your body fluids, what's going to happen to the pH of your body fluids? The CO2 levels go down, your pH will go back up. So this is one of the main ways that your body uses to control pH levels and help you maintain your body fluid pH between 7.35 and 7.45. That's done through adjusting the breathing rate. Okay, you also have chemoreceptors called peripheral chemoreceptors, which means they're in the periphery. They're not part of the central nervous system. And these are located in the carotid and aortic body. So those are clusters of sensory neurons around the carotid sinus, like we saw when we were studying cardiovascular control, and also in the aorta. We saw the same thing there when we were studying cardiovascular control as well. So they also monitor CO2 levels in the blood, and they're responsible for about 30% of the reaction to CO2 levels. All right, so hyperventilation, we talked a little bit about that before. That term means ventilation refers to breathing, so hyperventilation, you're breathing too quickly, too deeply. At any time, if you're doing that for any reason, and you're doing that and removing CO2, that can cause your CO2 levels to decline too much. You wind up with hypocapnia. If CO2 levels are too low, what's that going to do to your body fluid pH? If you have too low, CO2 is too low, that's going to raise the pH. So it may go above 7.45, and that puts you into a condition called alkalosis. Remember, alkaline means pH is above 7, and our body fluid pHs are a little bit normal body fluid pH is a little bit alkaline anyway, because 7.35 to 7.45 is alkaline. But if you go above 7.45, you're said to be in alkalosis. What do you think it is if you're below 7.35? Acidosis. So anytime your body fluid pH is below normal 7.35, that condition is called acidosis. Even if you're not necessarily below 7. Now, when you study pH, anything below 7 is acidic, but our normal body fluid pH is 7.35 to 7.45. If you're below 7.35, your body fluids are said to be more acidic than normal because the pH is lower, and that condition is called acidosis. Okay, hypocapnia is not a good thing because one of the things it triggers, if you go back and review what we talked about, blood flow to the brain and how that is very, very carefully controlled. But if you have low CO2 levels, that tends to trigger cerebral vasoconstriction, and that can actually lead to cerebral ischemia, where you're not having adequate blood flow into the brain, ischemia. Okay, another term you guys should be familiar with regarding depth and rate of breathing, apnea. That's where your breathing can actually cease. And one of the things that can trigger that is when your partial pressures of CO2 in your body fluids are abnormally low. Because if you think about it, if your CO2 levels are abnormally low, you don't want to breathe as deeply and as frequently as you normally would, because you want to allow CO2 levels to come back up to help control your pH. So if your CO2 levels are abnormally low, your ventral respiratory group may stop sending impulses to your diaphragm and intercostal muscles, and then you're not breathing at all. That's called apnea. And of course, we've all heard before about people having sleep apnea, where some people just stop breathing temporarily while they're sleeping. That's actually a pretty common problem. All right, interestingly, CO2 levels and hydrogen ion levels are the chief things that regulate your breathing rate. You would probably think, if I just asked you off the cuff and you had never studied the respiratory system, you would probably think it was oxygen levels. But because, remember, we said hemoglobin, most of the time when you're just in a normal everyday state, most of your hemoglobin, or most of the oxygen gas, doesn't get unloaded off of the hemoglobin to your tissue. So you have a reserve of oxygen gas under normal circumstances. So actually your the O2 levels in your blood have to drop pretty far below normal before they have any influence on your breathing rate. But nevertheless, you do have chemoreceptors in your aorta and in the around the carotid sinus, where the common carotid artery splits into the internal and external carotid arteries. You have some neurons there that sense O2 levels. They're excited by low O2. So when O2 drops pretty far below normal, they'll send impulses to the respiratory centers, and then that increases ventilation. Your breathing rate will go up. But it takes a pretty drastic drop. So normally we have about 95 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen gas in your oxygenated blood, which is what you would have in your aorta and your carotid arteries, remember. And that has to go down to about 60 before those chemoreceptors that monitor oxygen gas levels will send impulses up to the respiratory groups in the medulla and tell them, hey, you need to increase the breathing rate because we need to take in more oxygen gas. Interestingly, even when you're exercising, when you're exercising, you need more O2, but you're also generating more CO2. And it's actually your CO2 levels rising that plays the bigger role in causing your breathing rate to go up when you're exercising, because that pH must be maintained. That is an absolutely critical aspect of homeostasis. This is a picture from your book, which is just giving you a visual when we're talking about these carotid bodies and these aortic bodies, where you have these chemoreceptors that monitor CO2 and oxygen gas levels. That's where they're located. This is the common carotid artery, and this is where it splits into the internal and the external. So right at that junction, that's called the carotid sinus, and you have clusters of neurons there that monitor CO2 and oxygen gas levels, just like we talked about during the cardiovascular unit. And then you have some of those down here in the aortic arch as well. There's little clusters of nervous tissue. Okay, CO2 is not the only thing that influences pH. Okay, so your pH could be screwy even if your CO2 levels and your oxygen levels are normal. CO2 is the one that influences pH. There are other reasons why your pH may go down. Now, we already talked about having too much CO2 being retained. You're not exhaling out enough CO2, or you're over-generating CO2 due to exercise or stress, and you're not giving it off. But some other reasons: accumulation of lactic acid. That's also a byproduct of exercise. It's an acid, so that's going to lower pH. Remember when we studied diabetes mellitus? Diabetes patients, they can't use metabolized glucose. They can't use sugars for energy in a lot of their cells because they can't take it in. So instead, they have to rely on breaking down fats. And ketone bodies are a waste product from fat metabolism. Okay, and if you don't excrete those out in your urine like you're supposed to and get rid of them, they can build up, and they function as acids also in our body fluids, and you can wind up with ketoacidosis, and that is low pH below 7.35 that's due to an accumulation of these ketone bodies, which are, again, those are waste molecules generated from breaking down fats for energy. Okay, so anything that lowers pH will trigger the respiratory system to try to increase rate and depth of breathing. So even if it's not CO2, so even though your CO2 levels will be normal, if you're in ketoacidosis or you have too much lactic acid accumulation and that's lowering your pH, one of the ways that you can bring the pH back up is blow out more CO2. Get rid of that excess CO2. That is referred to as the respiratory system trying to compensate for another problem that is lowering the pH of your body fluids. It's respiratory compensation. So if something else is screwing up your pH, it's not the breathing rate that's the problem, but you can use the respiratory system, you can use your breathing rate to make an adjustment on the pH anyway, and so the respiratory system is said to be compensating for that problem. That's going to come up later in Unit 5 when we talk about acid-base balance and more about acid homeostasis or pH homeostasis. All right, another thing that influences breathing is called the Herring-Breuer reflex. There are stretch receptors in the pleurae, that's your parietal and visceral pleura, those serous membranes that surround each of your lungs. So within those membranes there are stretch receptors, so those are sensory neurons whose what they do is when the lungs inflate, they detect the stretching when the lungs are fully inflated, and kind of like the baroreceptors that we were talking about during cardiovascular that you have in those carotid sinuses. As the lungs inflate, they detect that stretching, so they send impulses up to the respiratory centers in the medulla. Now they're going to inhibit them, okay, which that makes sense. When your lungs are fully inflated, you don't want to keep contracting those inhalation muscles. You want to shut those down. You want those muscles to relax so that you can exhale. You can have a normal expiration. If that didn't happen, you would just keep inflating your lungs, inflating your lungs, and inflating your lungs, and that would not be a good thing. So these stretch receptors are used to make sure you don't overexpand your lungs. So it's more of a protective type response that occurs. You also have sensory receptors in your bronchioles that will respond to irritants. So the bronchioles are the tiny air passages that are leading to the alveoli, and you don't want irritants, you know, particles and things like that to be down deep into that area. And what they do is when they get activated, they detect irritants down deep in the lungs. They send out impulses that trigger reflexes that cause constriction of air passages. So you have smooth muscle tissue in the walls of your air passages, that will contract and constrict those air passages. We talked about that before as well. That's a protective type thing. If you're inhaling something that's an irritant, toxic, your air passages will actually constrict to try to limit the ability of whatever that is, limit its ability to go down deeper into the lungs and wind up in the delicate alveoli where they could be damaged. That would not be a good thing. Then you also have receptors in the larger air passages that when they get activated, they're what trigger coughing and sneezing reflexes. So those are reflexes that involve coordination with your breathing muscles so that you'll take a really deep breath and then forcibly exhale and sneeze out particles and other irritants that that are aggravating your respiratory tract. Same thing with coughing. You're forcefully exhaling very violently, trying to get rid of mucus down in your lower respiratory tract that has trapped dust and other types of particles, pollen, microorganisms, things like that, because you want to get those out of your lower respiratory tract. All right, our last lecture for 22 will kind of be a catch-all for some other topics. We'll talk about some respiratory adjustments, homeostatic imbalances. We've already talked about a few of those, but we'll talk about some more and a little bit about development of the lungs in while you're a fetus and then after birth.